I just got back from playing the Froscythe reworked on the War Within Alpha with both of the hero talent trees, and I have to say it is the bee's knees. It's finally here after years. We have the reworked talent, not to mention with the class and the spec and the hero talents brings Frost DK to a whole new level. So let's check it out really quick because I cannot contain myself how excited I am for this rework. And we're starting off with the first thing that I wanted to mention, which is Frostscythe that has been reworked. Now Frostscythe will consume 2 runes. It does a sweeping attack that strikes all enemies in front of you. This attack always critically strikes, and the critically strikes with Frostscythe deal 4 times the normal damage, and it will deal reduced damage past 5 targets. And consuming Killing Machine reduces the cooldown by 1 second because it actually has a 30-second cooldown now. This has always been kind of like a dead talent. It was really awkward to fit in because it used to take advantage of Killing Machine and consume Killing Machine procs, but now it just always crits. It just has a cooldown now, and Killing Machine actually functions into reducing its damage. And although tuning is, subject to change and depends on the numbers that we'll have on live, right now in single target it does more damage than Obliteration, and it doesn't consume Killing Machine proc, meaning that you actually have an extra ability that you rotate in and out. I'm not sure if you're going to take this on raids, on raid bosses, but in dungeons you can even use this on dungeon bosses if it continues to scale the way it does right now. And not to mention the AoE component is killer. And a lot of the biggest things that happened to Frost DK were the talents that were moved around and made more accessible with fewer 2-pointer nodes. You will notice that Pillar of Frost is smack dab in the middle, and it actually has all of its buffers right below it with only 1 point cost, which means Enduring Strength, Ice Cap, and Frostwhelp's Fury, which pretty much behave the same way. I think Frostwhelp's Fury was slightly altered, but it still does mostly the same thing. When you pop Pillar of Frost, you just take out a little Frostwhelp dragon and it just breezes up everybody, and the more targets it hits, the more mastery you gain at the end. Right now, it gives you 8% mastery per target hit up to, I think, 40% or 45% or something like that. Now, just underneath it now, we have Frostworm's Fury, the actual cooldown with the absolute 0 capstone just downstream from it. And we have a lot of other new talents, like Cryogenic Chamber, which is on the right side. We'll get to the capstone that you notice on the screen in a second. What Cryogenic Chamber does is each time Frostweaver deals damage, 15% of the damage dealt is gathered into the next cast of Remorseless Winter up to 20 times. This essentially beefs up your Remorseless Winter even more, giving it a cooler identity in AoE. There's also, if we go down to Breath of Sindragosa, there is a talent that hasn't yet been implemented, probably to alter Breath of Sindragosa, because, spoiler alert, I have played with it, and we are kind of really strong in the current version of the alpha, and everything just dies really quick, so it's very hard to see the full value of breath. But once you actually get to be able to do breath and the targets last for more than 20 seconds, the damage is out of this world, and that's very reassuring. Now, outside of that, let's talk about the new talents. First of all, we have just underneath Avalanche, Shattering Blade, which I believe we still have to this day, where Frost Strike can consume 5 stacks of Razor Ice to deal 100% more damage. I don't think you ever played this in Dragonflight at all. You never really want to consume the Razor Ice on your target because you want those to buff your damage. But there is a capstone now that just changes this entirely. Shattered Frost. When Frost Strike consumes the 5 Razor Ice stacks, it deals 50% of the damage dealt to nearby enemies, and it deals reduced damage beyond 8 targets. Once again, numbers are subject to change, but the dungeon that I did with this particular talent just had it at the top. This was my biggest damage source, which is really cool because it does give more power to Frost Strike, makes it more of an appealing ability to use as outside of just, oh, I need to just spend this bar of runic power because I want to proc those killing machines. So having a more incentive, or a bigger incentive rather, to spend Frost Strike, to spend runic power on Frost Strike feels so much better, not to mention that you can actually do AoE damage as opposed to having to use Glacial Advance. That is a different discussion altogether, because will you ever pick Glacial Advance now if you're using Frost Strike? Maybe for Obliteration, but at the same time you still have Avalanche that gives you the Razor Eyes, and that is actually a question that needs to be asked to see exactly where the value of your AoE runic power consumer will be going into the War Within. Now, we also have a new set of talent nodes that lead into also new capstone. First of all, we have Smothering Offense. Your auto attack's damage is increased by 6%. This amount is increased for each stack of icy talent you have, and it can stack up to 2 additional times. Getting more auto attack damage is very interesting. It doesn't feel like it does a lot of damage now on the alpha with the numbers that we have access to, so this could always, just be buffed a bit more. 6% auto attack damage is now really But we do have Icy Death Torrent. Your auto attacks critical strikes have a chance to send out a sleet of ice, dealing frost damage to enemies in front of you. This is just a proc on your crits, probably to incentivize more crit being used in your playstyle, and it also, works really well with stuff like Killing Machine, which is like a baseline thing for Frost DK, since auto attack crits generate that Kill Machine proc. And the capstone is The Long Winter. When Pillar of Frost is active, your auto attack's crits increase its duration by 1 second, up to a maximum of 5 seconds. This is very interesting and a little bit weird. So you would want a lot of crit to be able to crit with your auto attacks as much as possible. This also feels like you maybe want to dual wield to extend Pillar of Frost as much as possible. Now, extending Pillar of Frost to very long windows is something that you would want for obliteration as well, because that's the whole thing of obliteration. And having dual wield in obliteration was kind of like the thing that people did not want. They wanted those big obliteration hits. So this feels like something you would want to play with the obliteration playstyle, and this also feels like something you would want to play with dual wield. Does this mean that obliteration is just dual wield back and we say bye-bye to two-handers forever? That is a question that needs to be asked, because two-handers is very cool for Frost DK. It's a fantasy that everybody loves because we all love Arthas because he did nothing wrong. And speaking of obliteration, we have a new capstone, which is now really a new capstone. It's the old Shadowlands tier set, Arctic Assault. Consuming Kill Machine fires a glacial advance through your target. Essentially, this was what put obliteration back on the menu after about 2 expansions of just playing Breath of Sindragosa everywhere. This is what brought Frost DKs back into the fold for a lot of people back in Shadowlands, since this solves the biggest issue that obliteration had, and especially two-handed obliteration, and that was the application of Razor Ice, which Glacial Advance essentially solves. And having Kill Machines do that for you was something that we would have hoped we had going into Dragonflight as well, which was not the case. But now that we have this is an amazing addition to a really cool playstyle. And another change that was made was that Chill Streak can now bounce off of yourself if there are no other enemies there, which is okay. Chill Streak is a discussion that we will have at the end of the video. Until then, we need to check out the Twitch channel that we have, because that's where we test all of the alpha and play all of the specs on the alpha and discuss them live with you guys. Plus, on top of that, you can also hop in and do some keys and raids with us every week at twitch.tv/Marcelian&Online. On top of all the WoW discussions, we even get to play together. Isn't that fun? Isn't that what WoW is all about? All about that, connecting people to play WoW together. Now, let's go back to our Deathbringer, the hero talent that Frost has together with Blood, which we haven't talked about so far. Deathbringer is just fucking badass and cool. You would think that Rider of the Apocalypse is the bee's knees. Well, that's because you haven't played Reaper's Mark, which is the core functionality of Deathbringer. The Reaper's Mark is essentially a 1-minute cooldown ability that costs 2 runes. You viciously slice into the soul of your enemy, dealing quite a bit of Shadow Frost damage and applying Reaper's Mark. Each time you deal Shadow or Frost damage, you will add a stack of Reaper's Mark. After 12 seconds or reaching 40 stacks, the mark explodes, dealing quite a bit of damage. Reaper's Mark travels to an unmarked enemy nearby target if the target dies, or explodes below 35% health when there are no enemies to travel to, and this can only happen on a target every 3 minutes. That's just great. It's a lot of text and knowing that you'll just do a lot of damage with it. And going into it, you have stuff like Grim Reaper, which makes Reaper's Mark explosion deal more damage, and it's increased based on your target's missing health Also applying Soul Reaper to all targets below 35% health. Soul Reaper is really good, something that you can also access way easier this time around, considering that it's no longer a capstone and it's now just to the side of the talent tree. We covered that in on our Holy video, by the way, but definitely gives it more execute power. And to finalize the whole mechanic of the Reaper's Mark, you have the capstone called Exterminate. After Reaper's Mark explodes, your next obliteration costs no runes and summons 2 scythes to strike your enemy. The first scythe slices your target, dealing quite a bit of damage, and has a 20% chance to apply Reaper's Mark. The second scythe strikes all enemies around your target for quite a bit of damage as well. And now we get to the interesting part of how this mechanic works with all of its scythes and explosions. With the choice node Swift End and Painful Death. Swift End makes Reaper's Mark cost be reduced by 1 rune and its cooldown reduced to 30 seconds. Painful Death instead makes Reaper's Mark deal 10% more damage, and Exterminate empowers an additional Obliterate but now reduces its cost by 1 rune instead of 2. Additionally, Exterminate now has a 30% chance to apply Reaper's Mark, which is a nice gameplay loop of doing an Exterminate Obliterate, which means that you consume the mechanic and you scythe away, and then you reapply Reaper's Mark while still waiting for its cooldown to come back. I've played Deathbringer with both talent trees, and it does definitely feel better with Obliteration, considering that the cooldown of Reaper's Mark is reduced every time you consume Killing Machine, and you don't have more Killing Machines than you do with Obliteration. Rider of the Apocalypse feels also very good for Frost Death Knight, particularly because it feels like it's supposed to be played with Breath of Sindragosa, although maybe not exclusively. I did play with Breath of Sindragosa since it has way more runic power synergies than Deathbringer, and not to mention that Deathbringer is kind of problematic for Breath, but maybe that's because of Breath. First of all, Death Charger is such a good quality of life improvement to being able to maintain Breath of Sindragosa on your target, considering that you get knocked away in some of these dungeons, and you probably are seeing that on the screen right now, and you sometimes have to travel because the mob moves or the tank pulls things away, or you have to dodge something, so Death Charger just makes that way better to handle. Mossworn Menace also feels like it was made to work a little bit better with Breath because it reduces the cooldown of Horn of Winter by 15 seconds. Also Death and Decay by 10 seconds. A Horn of Winter specifically gets down to 30 seconds, and it's something that you will be able to use twice in a normal Breath window when you're just starting off. You cannot really hold it for too long, maybe for 35 seconds or something like that. You can just use Horn twice. And of course you can use it 3 times in usually mid-expansion, mid-endgame level Breath, where usually that takes about 1 minute or so to keep up. That is, of course, if Breath remains the same way as it is right now. And before we talk about that, we need to talk about the choice node of Fury of the Horseman versus a Feast of Souls. Fury of the Horseman makes every 50 runic power you spend extend the duration of the active horseman in combat by 1 second up to 5 total seconds. There is no playstyle that consumes runic power more efficiently than Breath of Sindragosa. Alternatively, a Feast of Souls makes while you have 2 or more horsemen aiding you, your runic power spending abilities deal 20% increased damage and have 10% chance to refund the rune. This sounds like it was actually made for Breath of Sindragosa, turning into a great playstyle if we can augment Breath to be easier to use and deal more damage. However, we now go to the capstone, which is Apocalypse Now. Army of the Dead for Unholy and Frostworm's Fury for Frost call upon all 4 horsemen to aid you for 20 seconds, which is how you can reliably get the A Feast of Souls buff on you while you have Breath of Sindragosa, since normally when you start combat, you usually use Frostworm's Fury as well. Usually, that means you will have to probably use Frostworm's Fury either just before popping Breath of Sindragosa or a little bit after you pop Breath of Sindragosa. This is also starting to get a little bit problematic because the cooldowns don't align, and we'll talk about that in a second, since the last thing that I want to point out is the talent called Hungering Thirst. The damage of your diseases, Frost Strike, Death Coil are increased by 15%. Death Coil doesn't really matter. Frost Fever is good, and you do have some talents to work with Frost Fever, but Frost Strike is not something that you want to press a lot as a Breath of Sindragosa DK or at all while your Breath window is up. But if you do decide decide to buff Froststrike, this could work really well with the Obliteration build and all the Froststrike buffers that we talked about in the spec talent tree, which are kind of a little bit at an opposition with Breath of Sindragosa. So there's a little bit of friction there that we might need to solve. And let's talk about why this friction exists and why Breath might still be a problem for DK. First of all, Breath of Sindragosa just seems to have way too many abilities that don't really synergize with it well. Either abilities that cost runes and don't give runic power, or abilities that consume runic power, which is not something that you want for a Breath playstyle. Reaper's Mark is maybe the biggest culprit of this, since you cannot use Reaper's Mark during Breath, and if you do play Breath, chances are that you might actually have Reaper's Mark become available during your Breath window. Frostscythe is another one that consumes runes and does not generate runic power, which I think it used to do, but it doesn't do so anymore. Pretty much every Froststrike buffers with the capstones and everything are something that you will probably not want. Don't get me wrong, they're probably going to be really good outside of Breath, but during Breath they're essentially dead talents, and if you do play Breath of Sindragosa Frost Decay, you want all of your damage to be in that window, and to extend that window for as long as possible, making these even more deader talents. Glacial Advance is an obvious one that you're not going to be using during Breath, and Chill Streak as well, which I think it's an even more deader talent now, because it actually has no synergies with your kit, considering that all of the talents that have been reworked, added or removed are synergistic with either Obliteration, Killing Machines, or Breath of Sindragosa, and Chill Streak does not interact with any of those whatsoever. Not to mention that it's even harder to get Chill Streak, considering that no matter what build you want to get, you will definitely want to go to all the way to the left hand side of the talent tree and pick up either Rage of the Frozen Champion or Frigid Executioner. And since Frost Decay probably has more builds now in terms of the capstones available, since you want to pick at least 2 capstones, most likely for the most amount of damage, you have even fewer talents to spend for stuff like Chill Streak. Similarly, Cryogenic Chamber could also be something that feels weird for Breath of Sindragosa Frost Decay, since it buffs Remorseless Winter even more, and the chances of you dropping Remorseless Winter during Breath are pretty high, meaning that you would want to refresh it. And if you press Remorseless Winter during Breath, that is probably at least anti-synergistic, but possibly a DPS loss as well. And I guess that kind of features in all of the Remorseless Winter buffered talent nodes. And in terms of building a Breath of Sindragosa Frost Decay, it's a little bit problematic at a first glance from an average DK's perspective, because you seem like you want Avalanche. You'll probably really want Avalanche, but you will definitely not want its capstones. There's also no more Hysteria Rune of Hysteria, so now you will have Fallen Crusader for sure, and likely back to using Razor Ice on the offhand. Does that mean that the Razor Ice triggering mechanics are essentially useless? Does that mean that this frees you up to not put a point into Avalanche and put it into something else? That is an interesting discussion and might actually be a really cool design for Frost Decay in the future, but we will have to see exactly what happens to the not yet implemented talent node leading up to Breath that might actually fix all of these issues altogether, considering that one of the biggest problems that Frost still has that they definitely want to work on when it comes to the DK rework, specifically on Holy and Frost, is the resources economy. It's terrible. You still over-generate runic power, and runes still feel like the best resource to spend, and all of the cool talents that have been added essentially want you to spend runic power, particularly on Froststrike, and that feels like it's going to be cumbersome, considering that some of the other cool abilities that have been added, particularly Frostscythe and Reaper's Mark, do not generate or consume runic power, but instead spend runes once again. So these are the first impressions of Frost Death Knight. The rework is amazingly cool. It's, I would dare say, cooler than the Unholy rework, although Unholy feels like it plays slightly more efficient, and you can check how it actually plays and functions with all the rework right here in this video, because Death Knight is on its path to being a proper modern World of Warcraft class in the War Within.